There is a city of 12 million people, a sprawling, breathing, grinding metropolis built over centuries of ambition and stone. Its underground veins carry millions of commuters each day, through ornate stations decorated with mosaics and marble, chandeliers and bronze statues. It is one of the most elaborate subway systems in the world. It is Moscow, and beneath its streets, something unexpected has been happening for decades. Dogs have been learning to ride the trains, not guided by humans, not trained by researchers, not following any script written for them by the species that built the tunnels in the first place. These dogs figured it out on their own. They learned to navigate one of the most complex urban transit systems on Earth, to recognize stations by smell and sound, to board and disembark at precisely the right stops, to manage crowds and turnstiles and the invisible social geometry of a city that largely tried to ignore them. They formed packs with ranks and hierarchies. They established territories across neighborhoods and transit hubs. They developed strategies for begging, for hunting, for survival. And over time, a population of what scientists began calling metro dogs quietly became one of the most remarkable examples of animal adaptation ever documented in a modern city. This is their story. Stay with us, because it gets stranger and more extraordinary the deeper we go. And if you want more stories like this one, about animals pushing the edges of what we thought possible, subscribe now. There is so much more to come. To understand how Moscow ended up with subway-riding dogs, you have to go back further than the metro itself. You have to understand what Russia's relationship with stray dogs looked like before the trains, before the revolution, before the city sprawled out into the enormous industrial giant it became in the 20th century. Stray dogs in Russia are not a new phenomenon. They are not the product of neglect alone, or carelessness alone, or poverty alone. They are the product of something far older. For centuries, Russians maintained a different cultural relationship with the boundary between domestic and wild. Dogs lived alongside humans in a looser arrangement than was common in Western Europe. They were fed, sometimes sheltered, sometimes not. They wandered markets and church courtyards. They were a presence in the city the way pigeons are a presence, ubiquitous, tolerated, part of the texture of daily life. The concept of the owned dog, the fully domesticated indoor companion, was not universal. Dogs existed in a middle space. They were neither entirely wild nor fully tame. This cultural attitude created a context in which stray dogs could persist and even proliferate without the same aggressive culling that characterized many other European cities. In Moscow and St. Petersburg and other Russian cities, street dogs were simply part of the urban landscape. They were fed scraps. They sheltered in doorways. They formed loose alliances with the humans who occupied particular neighborhoods. Then came the Soviet era, and everything about the city changed in ways that would have enormous consequences for the dogs living in it. During the Soviet period, Moscow was industrialized at a scale and pace that was almost violent. Factories were built. Enormous housing estates rose on the outskirts of the city. Industrial zones spread outward like a tide. And with all of this construction came something the dogs had not encountered before in quite this way. A completely new kind of urban geography. Vast campuses of industry and warehousing, with food waste and warmth and corners that were not carefully monitored by human authorities. The dogs followed the food, as they always have. They colonized the industrial zones. They formed packs in the spaces between the factories and the housing blocks, in the margins of the new Soviet city. And then the Soviet Union collapsed. The economic chaos that followed the fall of the USSR had consequences for nearly every living thing in Russia. Factories that had employed thousands closed overnight. Industrial estates that had generated enormous quantities of food waste went dark. Suddenly, the populations of stray dogs that had organized their lives around those food sources found themselves displaced. They had to move. They had to adapt. And Moscow, already one of the world's largest cities, with its complex web of streets and underpasses and transit infrastructure, was the landscape they had to adapt to. The metro had been open since 1935. By the early 90s, it was carrying an almost incomprehensible number of passengers each day. It was also warm in winter. It had the smell of food. It had the foot traffic of millions of humans. And humans, even in a hurry, can often be persuaded to drop a piece of something edible. For a dog learning to navigate a city in crisis, the metro was an opportunity. The first recorded observations of dogs using the Moscow metro are difficult to pin down precisely, because for years, Nobody was writing it down systematically. It was just something Muscovites noticed. You would be waiting for a train and a dog would be waiting too. Not anxiously, not confused, but waiting, with the particular stillness of an animal that knows what it is doing. The train would arrive, the dog would get on, the doors would close, the train would move. And at some point, several stops later, the dog would get off. People began to talk about this. It was striking, it was slightly unsettling, and it was impossible to ignore once you had seen it. By the early 2000s, enough people had witnessed it enough times that it began attracting serious attention. Andrei Poyarkov was a biologist who had been studying Moscow's stray dog population since the 1970s. He spent decades observing them, categorizing them, thinking about what their behavior revealed about intelligence and adaptation, and the long relationship between the dog lineage and the human world. By the time the metro dogs became a subject of public fascination, Poyarkov had already developed a sophisticated framework for understanding the different types of stray dogs in the city. He identified 4 broad categories. There were the wild dogs, living in forested areas on the outskirts, barely interacting with humans at all. There were the guard dogs, semi-feral animals that had attached themselves to particular buildings and compounds, acting in a quasi-domestic role without being truly owned. There were the scavengers, the dogs living off market waste and rubbish, who had learned to exist in proximity to humans without really engaging with them. And then there were the city dogs, the 4th category, the most evolved in terms of urban adaptation. These were the animals that had learned to read humans, to navigate human social rules, to use the city's infrastructure. The metro dogs came from this 4th group. What Poyarkov and other researchers began to document was not just interesting behavior. It was evidence of a cognitive capacity that demanded serious attention. To ride a subway train purposefully, a dog must solve several distinct problems simultaneously. It must know which station to board at, which means it must have learned to identify its location within the network. It must know where it wants to go, which implies a mental map of the city that extends across distances no dog could simply smell. It must recognize when to board, which means responding correctly to the arrival of the train, the opening of doors, the flow of human bodies. It must manage the journey itself, the noise, the movement, the crowds, the smell of dozens of other humans and animals, without losing its orientation. And it must know when to get off. That last step is perhaps the most astonishing. Getting on is something an animal could stumble into by accident, following the human flow. But getting off at the right stop requires either a complex timing mechanism or the ability to recognize a specific location. Multiple observers reported watching dogs that would doze during the journey and then rouse themselves and move toward the doors, exactly as the train approached the stop they habitually used. The leading hypothesis among researchers is that the dogs were using smell. The Moscow Metro is a system of distinct olfactory environments. Each station has its own combination of smells, drawn from the neighborhood above it, the particular commercial and food activity associated with it, the unique composition of human bodies and products flowing through it. A dog's nose is sensitive at a level that makes human olfaction seem almost vestigial. For an animal that navigates the world primarily through smell, a station has a signature as distinct and recognizable as a street address. But smell alone does not entirely explain what was being observed. Dogs were also responding to duration. They seemed to have developed a sense of how long the journey was supposed to take. They were integrating multiple kinds of sensory information, smell and time, and perhaps the particular texture of the train's movement as it decelerated into a familiar station, and using all of this together to make navigation decisions. This is not instinct. Instinct is behavior that emerges without learning, hardwired by evolution. What the metro dogs were doing was learned behavior of extraordinary sophistication, passed from individual to individual within packs, modified over time as conditions changed. It was, in the truest sense of the word, cultural learning. Poyarkov noted something else that was striking. The dogs that rode the metro were not all dogs. They were specific individuals, and typically, they were among the more senior and experienced members of their packs. The metro was not a random habit that any dog might fall into. It was a skill, acquired through observation and practice, that elevated the individuals who possessed it within the social hierarchy of their groups. A pack that included a metro rider had access to a larger range of food sources, could travel further, could cover more territory. The metro rider was an asset to the pack. This points to something that researchers found genuinely profound. These dogs were not just adapting to the city, they were developing social structures in which knowledge was valued and transmitted. They were, in a limited but real sense, doing something that humans recognize as culture. The packs themselves deserve close attention because their organization was not random either. It was not simply a matter of several dogs happening to occupy the same space. These were structured groups with defined leadership, with roles, with behavioral norms that were enforced internally. At the head of a pack, there was typically an alpha, usually male. But what was notable about the Moscow street dog alphas was that their dominance was not purely physical. In many wild canid populations, the biggest and most aggressive animal leads. In the Moscow packs, that was not reliably true. Poyarkov and his colleagues observed that the animals that achieved alpha status were often those with the best social intelligence, the most effective beggars, the best navigators, the animals that could manage complex interactions with humans without triggering negative responses. Brains in these packs carried weight alongside brawn. Below the alpha were subordinate ranks, animals that deferred to the leader but had their own specialized roles. Some were lookouts, some were primarily hunters, working together to target rats and pigeons in parks and underpasses. Some were specialists in human interaction, skilled in the particular art of appealing to commuters for food. This specialization in begging deserves its own examination because it reveals something remarkable about the dog's understanding of human psychology. Researchers documented dogs that would approach humans from behind and startle them gently by nudging their elbow or brushing against their leg. In the confusion that followed, the human would often drop food or become more susceptible to giving some away. This was not a behavior that worked with all humans. The dogs appeared to select targets with an accuracy that was not random. They preferentially approached people who were eating, obviously, but they also showed a tendency to approach women over men and children over adults. Populations that research has shown are more likely to respond sympathetically to a begging dog. Other dogs had learned to read the specific behavioral cues that signaled a human was psychologically open to engagement. A person walking fast with their eyes focused straight ahead was not a good target. A person pausing, looking around, in a moment of reduced purposeful focus, was. The dogs were reading human body language with a precision that spoke to thousands of years of coevolution. The domestication of dogs happened in large part because dogs that were good at reading human signals survived better. The Moscow street dogs had taken that ancient inherited sensitivity and sharpened it to a fine edge through learned adaptation. There is a specific behavior documented in the metro dogs that became particularly famous, partly because it seemed almost too sophisticated to be real. A dog at a busy station approaches a commuter who is eating. The commuter ignores the dog. The dog barks suddenly, sharply, once, causing the commuter to flinch. As the commuter flinches, the food in their hand is momentarily unguarded, and in that moment the dog snatches it. The sequence is so rapid that by the time the commuter has processed what happened, the dog is already walking away. This is not reactive behavior. This is planned behavior. The dog anticipated the consequence of the bark before performing it. It calculated, in some form, the causal chain from the action to the result and executed a timed sequence accordingly. Researchers who watched footage of this happening described it as the kind of behavior that, if observed in a primate in a laboratory, would be considered evidence of significant cognitive planning. And it was not done by every dog in the packs. It was done by specific individuals. Which means it was either a personality trait in those particular animals, or it was a learned behavior that some dogs had acquired and others had not. Either way, it demonstrated that within these packs there was meaningful individual variation in both ability and strategy. Territory was as important to the Moscow packs as food. The city was divided among the different packs in ways that were not formally mapped by any human authority, but were deeply real to the animals themselves. A pack's territory was typically organized around several core resources: a primary food source, usually a market or a restaurant district, or a transit hub with consistent food waste; a sleeping area with shelter and warmth and relative safety; a transit corridor, which for the metro dogs included the stations and sometimes the trains themselves; and a periphery that overlapped with neighboring packs' territories and was subject to constant low-level negotiation. These territorial boundaries were maintained through scent marking, through direct confrontation, and through the kind of consistent presence that signals ownership to other dogs. A pack that held a particular station entrance held it through the accumulated weight of months or years of daily return to that spot. They were known there. They were established. Other dogs learned, through experience, that challenging that claim was expensive. When conflicts between packs did occur, they could be intense and violent, but they were also, frequently, managed through escalating displays that stopped short of actual fighting. Researchers observed ritualized standoffs at territorial boundaries, contests of posture and vocalization that established or reaffirmed dominance without requiring injury to either party. This kind of conflict management is not trivial. Fighting is risky. An injured dog in the city faces a sharply reduced survival probability. Packs that could resolve boundary disputes through posturing rather than violence were packs that stayed healthier and more functional over time. The Moscow dogs appeared to have internalized this calculus. The territory a pack held was not static. It shifted over time as pack membership changed, as resources moved, as the city itself was altered by construction and development. New markets opened, others closed. Buildings that had provided shelter were demolished. Transit patterns shifted as new metro lines were added. The packs adjusted. This flexibility is itself significant. A rigid territorial animal, one that clings to a particular location regardless of whether that location continues to provide resources, is an animal that struggles when its environment changes. The Moscow packs showed a capacity to relocate, to learn new territories, to integrate new information about the urban environment into their behavioral strategies. This adaptability was what had kept the population viable through the enormous upheavals of the post-Soviet decades. But survival in the city was never easy, and the history of Moscow's stray dogs is not a simple story of triumphant adaptation. It is also a story of persecution, of population crashes, of the uneasy and often violent relationship between a dog population trying to survive and a human population that was frequently terrified of them and sometimes right to be. Attacks on humans by stray dogs were real and documented. Most interactions between Moscow's street dogs and humans were benign or even positive. The dogs had learned that humans were their primary resource base and that aggression toward humans was counterproductive. A dog that bit a commuter lost its access to that commuter's goodwill and risked a response from authorities that could end its life. The social calculus strongly favored restraint, but the packs were wild animals nonetheless. They were not domesticated in the full sense of the word. Their tolerance for humans had limits. A dog that was frightened, or cornered, or defending a resource it considered critical could and sometimes did bite. Children were at greater risk than adults simply because of their size and their tendency toward unpredictable movement. There were incidents, and they attracted enormous media coverage, and each incident intensified the political pressure on city authorities to do something about the street dog population. The city's response to its stray dog population shifted multiple times over the decades, and each shift had consequences for the dogs and for the humans trying to manage the situation. In the Soviet period, culling had been the primary tool. Dogs were caught and killed, and the population was kept at a manageable level by persistent removal. But killing stray dogs is politically unpopular in most societies, and Russia in the post-Soviet period was no exception. Animal welfare organizations grew more vocal. Muscovites who had personal attachments to specific neighborhood dogs pushed back against cull programs. The city shifted toward a catch, neuter, vaccinate, return approach, releasing sterilized dogs back into their territories on the theory that a stable, established population of non-reproducing dogs would be less problematic than a constantly replenished wave of new animals. This policy was itself controversial and was never fully or consistently implemented. It required resources, organization, and political will that fluctuated with each change in city administration. The dog population rose and fell, not just in response to ecological pressures, but in response to the rhythms of human politics and the shifting priorities of municipal government. What remained constant through all of these shifts was the dogs themselves. Each generation of street dogs in Moscow was born into an environment of extraordinary complexity and pressure. They faced traffic, which killed many of them. They faced disease, which moved rapidly through populations of animals living at close quarters in urban conditions. They faced cold winters that could be lethal without adequate shelter. They faced direct persecution from individual humans who resented their presence or feared them, or simply found them an obstacle. And they faced competition, both with each other and with other urban scavengers, for the food resources the city provided. The animals that survived these pressures were, in a very real sense, selected for urban intelligence. Each generation that successfully navigated the metro, that managed its relationships with humans, that maintained viable territory and pack structure, was passing its genes forward. Over the decades, the Moscow street dog population was not just adapting behaviorally. It was, in the most fundamental biological sense, evolving. The city was selecting for specific traits, and those traits were becoming more common in the population over time. Researchers who examined the Moscow street dogs noted physical as well as behavioral changes compared to the dog's likely ancestors. They tended toward a medium size, not small enough to be vulnerable to larger predators or to struggle in the cold, not large enough to require a food intake that the city's scraps could not reliably support. They had an alert, but not hyper-reactive temperament. They were wary enough of genuine threats to avoid them, but calm enough in the overwhelming sensory environment of the city not to be constantly overwhelmed. They had, in a real sense, become city animals in the way that foxes in London or coyotes in Los Angeles have become city animals, shaped by the urban environment itself. But the Moscow dogs were doing something that the foxes and coyotes were not. The foxes in London used the city's geography opportunistically. They move through gardens and alleys and exploit the food waste that human habitation generates. But they do not use the city's infrastructure. They do not board vehicles. They do not navigate by transit stops. They exploit the city at the level of geography, the physical landscape. The Moscow Metro dogs were operating at a different level entirely. They were exploiting the city at the level of system. They were using human technology, human infrastructure, in a way that required them to understand, in some functional sense, how that technology worked. Not the electrical engineering of it, not the logistics of scheduling and maintenance, but the observable rules of the system as experienced from the platform. When train arrives, doors open, passengers move, train departs. Board before departure, disembark at destination. Those rules, abstracted to their behavioral essentials, were what the Metro dogs had learned. There is a debate among animal behavior researchers about what the appropriate language is for describing this kind of learning. Some are cautious about any framing that implies the dogs understood what they were doing in a way that implies conscious deliberation. The concern is that anthropomorphism, the projection of human cognitive processes onto animal behavior, leads to sloppy science and overstated claims. These are legitimate concerns, and they are worth taking seriously. But the more conservative framing has its own problems. To say that the Metro dogs were responding to a learned sequence of conditioned stimuli, that they had no representation of the Metro as a system, that there was no internal model of the city in their minds, is to make a claim that the behavior does not actually support. Conditioned responses are rigid. They fire when the stimulus is present and do not fire when it is absent. The Metro dogs showed behavioral flexibility. They adapted when routes changed. They found alternative strategies when their normal begging spots were disrupted. They transferred learning from one context to another. This is not what simple conditioning looks like. Something more complex was happening. The most honest position is probably that we do not yet have the cognitive science to fully characterize what was going on inside these dogs' minds. The behavior was extraordinary. The mechanisms that produced it were consistent with a level of cognitive sophistication that challenges some comfortable assumptions about the hard boundary between human intelligence and animal intelligence. And that challenge is worth sitting with, because it has implications that extend well beyond dogs. Among the most closely observed of the Moscow packs were those that had established territories centered on specific metro stations. Researchers documented packs that used particular stations as home bases, returning to them consistently across seasons and years. These stations served multiple functions simultaneously. They were warm in winter, they had consistent food from commuters and nearby food vendors. They were covered, providing shelter from rain and snow, and they were connected to the wider network, allowing dogs with metro riding ability to access other parts of the city as needed. The packs that held metro station territories were among the most successful in the city. They had the most consistent access to resources, and they showed the lowest rates of the kind of desperate and dangerous behavior, charging, biting, aggressive confrontation with humans, that was associated with dog packs in genuinely precarious situations. Comfortable animals are manageable animals. The station packs had stability, and that stability made them paradoxically, the most benign of the city's stray populations. Station staff became important figures in the lives of these packs. The relationship was not exactly one of ownership. The dogs were not pets, but over months and years of shared space, something like a mutual understanding developed. Staff learned which dogs were present, and roughly how they behaved. Dogs learned which staff members were tolerant, which would provide food, and which presented a threat. These relationships were individualized. A dog that had a positive history with a particular cleaner or security guard would approach that person with a confidence it would not display with a stranger. It had a social memory, and it used that memory to calibrate its behavior. This is, again, a capacity that requires careful description. Dogs in general are extraordinarily good at reading individual humans and remembering individual human faces and behaviors. This is a product of the domestication process, which over thousands of years has selected very strongly for the ability to attend to and learn from human behavioral signals. The Moscow Street Dogs were drawing on this deep genetic heritage and applying it in the specific social context of the metro station environment. What emerged in some stations was something that observers described with genuine surprise. The dogs were not merely tolerated. They were, in certain respects, cared for. Regular commuters who encountered the same dog day after day across years began to feel a personal connection to that animal. They brought specific foods. They noted the dog's health and condition with the attention of someone monitoring something important. If a familiar dog was absent, there was a concern that was not trivial to the human feeling it. The dogs, for their part, seemed to recognize these particular humans and respond to them in specific ways that they did not display with strangers. The interaction had become, without anyone designing it or deciding it, a relationship. This is an old story in new clothes. The domestication of dogs began with exactly this kind of gradual, mutually reinforcing interaction between humans and canines living at the edges of each other's social worlds. Neither party set out to domesticate anything. It emerged from proximity and mutual benefit, from the slow accretion of individual interactions that over time became patterns that reshaped the animals involved. What was happening in the Moscow metro stations was not domestication in the full sense, but it was recognizably the same process, running in miniature in the particular social ecology of a 21st century subway system. The dogs that developed these individual relationships with specific humans were also the dogs that were most consistently safe. They had human advocates. When the periodic pressure for removal and culling built up, the station dogs with known human supporters were the ones most likely to survive the response. The relationship was not just emotionally significant to the humans involved. It was, in the most practical terms, life insurance for the dogs. This points to a broader truth about the Moscow Street Dog situation that is easy to miss if you focus only on the dramatic aspects, the metro riding, the begging strategies, the territorial conflicts. The dogs that survived best in Moscow were not the biggest or the fastest or the most aggressive. They were the ones that had most effectively navigated the social world of the city. They had found allies. They had made themselves useful, or at least pleasant, to specific humans. They had managed their relationships with the human population of the city in ways that generated protection and resources. They were, in a very real sense, practicing politics. The word seems excessive for a dog, but consider what it actually means. Politics is the management of relationships and resources within a social group. It involves understanding the motivations of others, identifying potential allies and adversaries, managing the impressions you make, and using social connections as a form of capital. The metro dogs were doing all of these things. Not with language, not with the formal institutions that humans use to structure political life, but with the behavioral tools available to a highly socially intelligent animal, operating in an enormously complex social environment. Poyarkov, toward the end of his life, spoke about what decades of studying these dogs had meant to him intellectually. He was struck above all by the evidence they provided about the relationship between intelligence and environment. The Moscow Street Dogs were not genetically unique. They were not a special breed. They were the ordinary mixed-breed descendants of dogs that had lived in cities for generations. What had made them extraordinary was the pressure of their environment. The city had demanded intelligence and flexibility and social sophistication, and over time, through the brutal filter of survival and reproduction, those qualities had become more common in the population. This is evolution in action, visible within the span of a human lifetime, not in the fossil record but on the platforms of a working subway system. It is adaptation made visible in the behavior of animals you could watch from 30 feet away. There are other cities in the world with significant stray dog populations. Mumbai, Istanbul, Bucharest, Tbilisi, Cape Town. Each of these cities has its own version of the relationship between humans and street dogs. In Istanbul, stray dogs and cats have been part of urban life for so long that they are woven into the cultural fabric of the city. They have names given to them by neighborhood residents. They have documented personalities that are discussed by locals with the same casual familiarity with which you might discuss a neighbor's habits. The Istanbul street dogs do not, as far as researchers know, use the metro in the systematic way that the Moscow dogs did. But they show many of the same social and cognitive adaptations: the ability to read human behavior, the formation of stable territorial packs, the specialization of individual roles within those groups. What Moscow had that was unique was the metro itself. The specific characteristics of the subway system, its size, its warmth, its consistent human traffic, its olfactory diversity across stations, created an opportunity that dogs with the right cognitive equipment could exploit. Not every urban dog population had that opportunity. But among those that did, the Moscow dogs were the ones that took fullest advantage of it. And in doing so, they created a phenomenon that was not just biologically remarkable, but genuinely new. An animal that was using human infrastructure in a way that required it to understand the system, not just occupy the space. By the 2010s, the Moscow Metro dogs had become genuinely famous. Documentary crews from around the world arrived to film them. Academic papers multiplied. The story appeared in mainstream media outlets across dozens of countries. It became, briefly and then persistently, a reference point in broader public discussions about animal intelligence, about urban ecology, about the unexpected consequences of building enormous cities and then trying to control what lives in them. The dogs themselves were indifferent to their celebrity, as dogs tend to be. They continued doing what they had been doing, waiting on platforms, boarding trains, getting off at the right stops, working the commuter crowds for food, maintaining their territories, living, in the way of all wild things, entirely in the present. But the human attention they attracted was not without consequences. It intensified the political debate about their management. It created a public constituency for their protection that had not previously existed in quite the same organized form. When city authorities announced programs that would result in the removal or culling of station dogs, there were now protesters at the metro stations. There were online campaigns. There were letters written to city officials. The dogs had acquired, through their visibility and through the emotional responses they generated in human observers, a form of social capital that translated into political protection. This is not unique in the history of human-animal relationships. Charismatic species have always fared better in conservation debates than uncharismatic ones. The species that humans find beautiful or impressive or emotionally resonant attract more resources, more attention, more protection. The Moscow Metro dogs were charismatic, not in the way of large predators or colorful birds, but in the specific way of intelligent social animals doing something that surprised and delighted humans. They made people feel something, and that feeling had effects in the world. There was something else the Metro dogs revealed that had implications beyond the story of dogs specifically. They demonstrated, with unusual clarity, what urban environments are actually doing to the wildlife that inhabits them. Cities are not ecological dead zones. They are not simply barriers to wildlife or destroyers of habitat, though they are those things too. They are also selective environments that reward specific kinds of cognitive ability, that drive adaptation and evolution in the animals that live in them, that create new niches and new opportunities for species flexible enough to exploit them. The crow populations of cities around the world have been generating similar findings for years. Urban crows use tools, cache food in complex spatial patterns, recognize individual human faces, and transmit that recognition socially, adapt their behavior to local conditions in ways that vary city by city. Urban foxes show different behavior from rural foxes: bolder, more socially tolerant, more willing to engage in complex interactions with humans and human infrastructure. Coyotes moving into American cities have begun showing behavioral changes that parallel, in smaller measure, what the Moscow dogs exhibited over a longer time scale. Cities are, apparently, doing something to the animals that live in them. They are making some of them smarter, or at least selecting for the kind of behavioral flexibility that produces smart-looking behavior in the specific context of an urban environment. The implications are not entirely comfortable. If cities are selecting for intelligence and flexibility, and if the animals that persist in cities over generations are increasingly those with the cognitive equipment to navigate complex human social environments, then the cities of the future may be inhabited by animals that are, in the relevant senses, considerably more capable than the ones that came before them. We are not just building environments that animals happen to live in. We are building selection pressures that are reshaping what those animals are. The Moscow Metro dogs were, in this sense, a preview, an early and unusually visible example of a process that is happening in cities all over the world in ways that are usually too slow or too diffuse for casual observation. They happen to make it unmistakable, because a dog on a subway train is impossible to ignore, because what they were doing was legible and dramatic and immediately comprehensible to any human observer. But they were not anomalies. They were the leading edge of something. In recent years, the circumstances for Moscow's street dogs have changed, as they always do. Different city administrations have taken different approaches to the stray population. Construction and development have altered the geography of neighborhoods and transit hubs. The dogs' territories have shifted. Individual packs have risen and declined. The metro dogs have continued, though perhaps in smaller numbers and with less consistency than was documented in the years of peak observation. The city changes, and the dogs change with it. What does not change is what they demonstrated. They showed that the boundary we draw between the cognitive world of humans and the cognitive world of other animals is not as firm or as clear as our comfortable assumptions would prefer it to be. They showed that intelligence is not a single fixed capacity, but a collection of abilities that can be combined in different configurations by different minds to solve different problems. They showed that evolution is not a process that happened in the distant past and is now safely over, but an ongoing dynamic that responds to every pressure that any environment creates for any organism within it. They showed that cities, those enormous human constructions, those monuments to our ingenuity and our ambition, are also wild places. They are places where evolution continues, where intelligence finds unexpected expressions, where the line between the built and the natural blurs, in ways that exceed our ability to fully track or control. A dog waiting on a platform, ears alert, eyes scanning the gathering crowd, nostrils processing the complex chemistry of a city in motion. The train arrives, and the dog moves forward without hesitation. This is knowledge. Not knowledge that any human gave it, knowledge it found on its own, by being exactly what it is. An animal that has lived alongside our species long enough to have learned something of how we think, and then gone somewhere with that learning that even we did not expect. The doors open, the dog steps on, and somewhere across the city, several stops away, there is a place the dog knows. A corner of the city that belongs to it, that it has earned and maintained, and returned to day after day across the long accumulation of its life. The train begins to move, the dog settles, calm as any commuter at the end of a working day. The city rushes past, outside the windows, the city it was not built for. The city it made its own anyway. There is more intelligence in the world than we have learned to see. Moscow's dogs found a way to make that undeniable. And all they needed was a train, a nose that could read the city like a map, and the ancient inherited ability to watch what the world does and learn from it. The same ability that brought their ancestors in from the cold 10,000 years ago. The same ability that is doing something in cities right now, in 100 forms and 100 species, that we have barely begun to document. Watch this space. The animals are not waiting for us to catch up.